So you want to build a massive chest. Well, in this video, I'm going to show you 3 science-backed steps to build a massive chest. Now, first, we're going to be covering the mechanisms of hypertrophy. Now, the reason why is because a lot of the times people will get information from YouTube or articles or Instagram, and a lot of the times they can even be really good pieces of advice. But here's the problem. If you don't understand the fundamental underlying principles that drives these recommendations in the first place, there's a higher probability that you're not going to apply them as effectively as you could if you did understand them. So what I want to do is make sure not only that you know exactly what you need to do, but you know why you're doing it so that you can actually have a much broader scope of application to your training. So we're going to start out talking about mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy. Then we're going to move into some of the biomechanics, functional anatomy. This is actually extremely important. It's one thing that people mess up all the time. The shape of your rib cage, breathing patterns, and all sorts of different things that actually affect how we're targeting specific muscle fibers in different regions, even of the same muscle group. Very important, okay, and extremely underutilized. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about exercise selection, exercise execution, joint range of motion, all sorts of different things. We're going to talk about implementation as well. And so this is the third and final step. Now, it's not enough to just talk about the theory. We want to understand the practice. How do you implement this into your exact circumstance? So that's what I'm going to give you today. We're going to talk about exercise selection, execution, training frequency, rep ranges, how to structure your kind of training cycle. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of certain exercises, exercise variability, SRA curves, all sorts of stuff. And if you stay till the end, I'm going to give you guys an additional free gift, which is a bench press manual. This is a very comprehensive bench press manual. So if you are also interested in increasing your strength, as well as just improving your biomechanics for bench press, this is a must-have. This is an article that I wrote, or it's a manual actually that I wrote for Kabuki Strength, and it was one of their most popular manuals that they had on their website. All right? So make sure you stay tuned until the end to find out how you can get your own copy. So let's talk about growth, okay? The primary drivers of muscle growth. There's been several mechanisms that have been presented, but the main one is going to be mechanical tension. Now, mechanical tension is essentially tension that occurs within the actual muscle itself. And what happens when you apply tension to the muscle is it sets off a cascade of different events that basically have signaling that elicits that response. So we need to make sure that we're applying sufficient amount of tension to the target tissues. It's not enough just to be slinging weights. We need to make sure that the generation of force is occurring through the target tissues, that the pec itself is absorbing the load and then generating force to move it, okay? We're not just trying to be super efficient necessarily and utilize as many muscles as possible. And we'll get into all the details of that later. So we want to make sure that we have a directed stimulus to create tension in the target tissue. So that's going to be the primary driver. Now, you can think of it in a couple different ways, but I find the easiest way to conceptualize it in terms of like how it's being applied is an acute to a cumulative approach. So if you do a 1 rep max let's say on the bench press, okay, that is an acute spike in tension. We're only doing a single rep, so we don't have much cumulative tension, but we've got a dramatic spike in mechanical tension for a single rep. So that's the acute approach. Then we have more of a cumulative approach. So over here we did a 1 rep max, okay? So we know our proximity to failure. We're 0 reps away from failure, okay? That's our 1 rep, all right? We couldn't do another one. So if we take a higher volume approach or higher repetition approach to that same proximity to failure, let's say we're doing 15 reps, okay? Now, for the first couple of reps on the bench press, not really a whole lot's going on. We're not really creating a whole lot of mechanical tension. But then as we get closer to failure, all of a sudden tension's building across the course of that set. And so we have cumulative fatigue and cumulative tension that builds over time, over the course of that set. Now, the next one is going to be metabolic stress. Now, there actually is quite a bit of debate on whether or not metabolic stress is actually a significant contributing factor to muscle growth, okay? Chris Beardsley is one of the leading experts on the planet. He estimates that it's probably not, and that mechanical tension is probably the only primary or the only driver of muscle growth, but it's a little bit more complex. So if you want to learn about that, I'd highly recommend checking him out. He's got tons of phenomenal content. He is a researcher, so it is very technical, but if you are interested, if you are a nerd, you want to check it out, highly recommend it. Metabolic stress though, just kind of a Cole's Notes version. When you train, there's various metabolic byproducts and different things like that that occur. So like you get production of lactate, you get production of hydrogen ions, different things like that. And that is basically some of the metabolic stress and the metabolic byproducts that are created during that training process, okay? And that's said to either directly or indirectly elicit some sort of, hypertrophic response, okay? So we're not going to go too deep into that, though, and the reason why we're not going to go too much deeper into just what I mentioned right now is because whether metabolic stress is a significant contributing factor or whether it's not, it still wouldn't actually change how you apply what we're going to talk about today, okay? So the reason why that might be important or the reason why that might be contentious is more so from like a research standpoint, but in terms of how you're applying a lot of these things, it really doesn't change a whole lot. We'll kind of talk about that as we go on, but you'll understand a little bit more why it wouldn't, all right? So let's talk about low reps versus high reps, all right? Now, when we talk about doing lower reps, generally we need to be within a certain proximity of failure in order to elicit muscle. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But the reason why I'm saying that on the outset, is because when I talk about low reps versus high reps, there's kind of an underlying assumption that when we're doing higher reps, we're using slightly lighter weights. And when we're doing lower reps, we're using slightly heavier weights, okay? So we're using an appropriate load to kind of account for the change in repetitions, all right? So it's kind of an underlying premise, basically. So when I'm talking, you can always kind of assume lower reps mean higher loads. Higher reps generally mean lower loads, and this is relatively speaking. So research shows that both high reps and low reps, when taken to failure, elicit the same results when it comes to muscle growth. Now, a lot of people have kind of extrapolated this out a little further than they should have, and they say, well, therefore it's equal. It produces equal results in terms of hypertrophy. That is not true, not even in the slightest. And the reason why that's not true is because these findings are done in a very short period of time. And there's a lot of practical issues that would change that entirely in the long run, okay? So, one, let's look at the differences in terms of adaptations. Well, let's say we're doing 5 repetitions versus 15 to 20 repetitions, okay? And the scope of rep ranges that produce substantial hypertrophy are, around 5 reps all the way up to like 30 and even 50 reps sometimes. But for conversation's sake, we'll just say between 5 and 30 repetitions is where you're going to see most of the work. That's a very, very big difference. So if we compare someone doing 5 reps, let's say on average, their rep scheme is between 4 to 8, okay? And they're trying to build muscle. They're going to have substantially more neurological adaptations than someone who's doing training in the rep range of, let's say, 15 to 20 or 20 to 25, okay? Very different outcomes long term. This guy is going to get hella strong. This guy is going to get stronger, but definitely not that much. The neurological side of things, definitely not going to get the same adaptations as this guy will, okay? So that's one thing. Differences in motor coordination, differences in terms of fatigue is going to be huge. So in that research that I was discussing earlier, where they found roughly equivocal results, the higher load group and the lower repetition group generally experienced higher fatigue, okay, which is unsurprising. When you're lifting really heavy loads, that's generally more systemically fatiguing than lifting lower loads for higher repetitions, even if the proximity to failure is very similar. So differences in fatigue, we get differences in orthopedic stress, right? If you're lifting heavier loads and you're really, bracing, especially if you're doing something like a squat or a bench press, that can create more orthopedic stress, okay? So stress in your joints and things like that. So that's not necessarily desirable. Now, we do want some amount of stress so we can have productive adaptations, but too much, not the best thing, especially if you're doing this for a long time. We want to make sure you're remaining healthy and injury-free as much as possible, because long-term adherence to training is ultimately the biggest determining factor of your success, okay? So we want to keep you healthy and injury-free. Now, based on what I've said so far, a lot of people conclude prematurely that, well, if lower repetitions and higher load is more systemically fatiguing, if it can potentially cause more orthopedic stress, then probably not the best idea. I should probably just stick over here. And therefore, this one, the higher rep side, is probably better. That's not necessarily true, okay? And one of the most obvious reasons for why that's not true is if you expand that timeline, okay? So if you're training for 10 years, let's say, I guarantee you're going to go across the entire spectrum multiple times. Low reps, moderate reps, high reps, okay? Now, why is that? Well, let's imagine you're a powerlifter. If you're a powerlifter and you want to get stronger, is your objective to lift a 1 rep max all the time? No, it's not. You can't. You're going to get beat the hell up and you're never going to get stronger. You're going to get injured. And within a year, you're probably just going to, actually, within a couple of weeks, you're probably just going to be totally done, right? If that's all you're doing. Now, conversely, if you're only ever doing higher repetitions, you're never going to be able to reach maximal strength expression, right? So there needs to be a balance, right? Periodization is essentially based off of, going from higher repetitions, lower specificity, all the way to lower repetitions and, hyper specificity or hyper sport specificity, okay? So when you're training, you want to be thinking about things like exercise variability. You want to be thinking about minimizing overuse injuries. So we're not just using the same loading parameters all the time. We're also not using the same exercises. We're using different executions of the same exercise. And there's a variety of different things. But ultimately, we need to undulate things in order to see the best results. Even if it's just from a novelty perspective, training does get stale over time. And sometimes we kind of squeeze out all of the results we can from utilizing a certain rep range, which is another reason why it's a good idea to be utilizing a variety of different rep ranges throughout your training career, okay? So it's not correct to say that one is necessarily better than the other. I would definitely say that I would bias probably a rep range of 5 to 15 reps, and that's kind of where the vast majority of my work would be. But again, there's definitely going to be times where I'd use much more. Like I've programmed 50 repetitions for like triceps for someone. Like I've done 50 reps, and there's various reasons for why you might want to do that. And I've covered that in other lectures, so we're not necessarily going to cover it here. But there's a variety of very good reasons for why you might use a variety of different rep ranges, even within the same mesocycle, where you might be doing super heavy lifting over here, but then on another day, you're doing lighter, much more volume stuff, right? And another day, you're doing kind of moderate volume, moderate repetitions. So it's not super heavy. Proximity to failure is actually, not very close to failure, but you're doing, some good general work as well, okay? So there's a variety of reasons for doing things, and there's a lot of different ways you can do things correctly, okay? Let's talk about stretch-mediated hypertrophy as well, all right? So we talked about mechanical tension and how applying tension to the tissues creates a cascade, like a signaling cascade that can elicit muscle hypertrophy. So stretch-mediated hypertrophy, and the way that you can kind of think this from a practical standpoint is research now is kind of showing that, or at least it suggests that the most hypertrophic range is generally going to be the lengthened and mid-range position. So what that means is if I were to just do bicep curls from the lengthened position here to here and down, I'm going to get better results than if I were doing the exact same range, but from the mid-range to the shortened range, okay? So I'm utilizing the same general range of motion throughout both sides, except in the lengthened to shortened, there's going to be more stretch on the tissue, which means that that's going to be the more productive range. So utilizing a lengthened or biasing a lengthened and mid-range position, generally speaking, is going to elicit really good results, okay? And so we want to make sure that that is something that we keep in mind when we're thinking about exercise selection and exercise execution. Now, we don't just want to train partials all the time. You do want to utilize full range of motion for most exercises. That's going to be a very good rule of thumb, but there's definitely a benefit in terms of selecting movements that have a specific bias, even if it's utilizing, let's say, bands or different things like that, that can bias the loading parameters, or there's a lot of different things that you could do, right? But that gets a little bit more technical. Now, when we're talking about the loading parameters of an exercise and range of motion, it's important to understand that just because we're using a full range of motion of the exercise range of motion is very different than the muscle's range of motion. So if I'm utilizing full range of motion on a bench press, even if I have no arch, my back's completely flat, that is nowhere near the full range of motion of my pec, right? I'm here on a bench press and that bar is touching my chest. But if I'm doing a pec fly, that's where my arm would be, right? Same range of motion. But I can move that way, way further back, so I can really bias the pec utilizing different exercises. So although we want to generally utilize the complete exercise range of motion, we need to understand that not all exercises are going to take the muscle through its fully lengthened position. That's going to affect which exercises you choose and how you choose to load the tissue. So for instance, if I'm doing a pec fly like this, probably not going to have 100-pound dumbbells. Why? Because I'm probably going to tear my fucking pec off. If I'm doing dumbbell press, I might be doing 140-pound dumbbells for, like a set of 12 or 15, right? Because it's not a big deal. My leverages here are much better. Whereas if I go back here, I might only be using 30 pounds, right? So it really does change the loading. It changes where you're biasing and what the intent is of that exercise. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, there's going to be trade-offs because, again, maybe I'm getting more mechanical tension doing it this way because I'm getting more loading on my chest, but that does not mean that that's necessarily better. Because here, yes, I'm using less load doing a pec fly, especially like a cable fly, because that has just a better force profile, better line of pull and everything like that. But not only that, I'm getting a much better stretch. So yes, I'm reducing the absolute load that I'm using, so I'm not getting as much loading on the tissues, but I'm getting a really, really great stretch. So is one better than the other? You can definitely make a strong argument for, one over the other. I'd probably bias the more loading over just the stretch. But at the end of the day, luckily for us, we don't have to select one over the other. But it's still important to understand the benefits and the trade-offs of each exercise, because that way we can effectively choose the appropriate exercise so we can check off all the boxes, or at least most of the boxes in a given mesocycle. Okay. Now, let's look at exercise variety. Let's look at fatigue management and orthopedic health. So, as I mentioned earlier, we need variability. Variability is extremely important when it comes to long-term health of the athlete. We can't just do the same thing over and over and over again. In fact, one big mistake that I see is when I'll coach a client and I put them through a mesocycle. So let's say it's like a 6 or 8 week mesocycle. They get really good progress, okay? And then they're like, awesome, I want to run that back. No. You do not want to run that back. If you run that back, the same program, it's not going to produce the same results. You're not going to just keep doubling it up. That's not how it works. You've adapted to that stimulus. We need to change the stimulus to something a little bit more novel because you've already kind of milked out the vast majority of that progress. If you go through that exact same cycle again, you're going to get nowhere near the same amount of progress, and you're probably just going to beat up your joints and get some overuse injuries because you've been utilizing the same patterns for too long. Because it's not just about doing things that activate your chest, it's the specific movements that are going to cause the cumulative fatigue on your joints, on your ligaments, tendons, things like that. So we need to make sure that we're utilizing different exercises, different range of motions, different loading parameters, different rep ranges, and all sorts of range of motions and things like that in order to make sure that we're keeping you healthy and we're also eliciting the most stimulative training. Okay, so we can't just do the same thing over and over and over. It gets stale, and that's where people kind of start to plateau. So we don't want to be doing the same thing over and over and over. We want to make sure if we have like a checklist of these are all the really, really important things, we want to make sure we're checking off as many boxes as we can reasonably do that makes sense based on where you're at in your training. There are some times where you definitely might want to actually back off some of those boxes instead of focusing on all of them. There's definitely like more specialization periods or different reasons for why you might want to focus on one thing and kind of back off on something else, right? But again, that's a little bit more technical and it's not necessarily as relevant right now. Okay, so proximity to failure. This was something I'd mentioned earlier. Now, when we look at proximity to failure, most of the research shows that the vast majority of your muscle growth is really going to occur once you kind of reach that 3 and under reps shy of failure. Okay, so if you're training and you're like 15 reps away from failure, probably not going to elicit that much muscle growth. But if you're training to like 3 reps shy of failure, 2 reps, 1 rep, or even 2 failure, even beyond failure, by using things like drop sets or cluster sets or like just kind of a mechanical drop set or anything like that, that can elicit substantial muscle growth, okay? So proximity to failure, generally research shows that the maximum amount of muscle growth is going to occur once you kind of hit that 3 reps in reserve and less, okay? Now, when taking a set to failure, we need to consider the fatigue cost and the risk associated with that as well. So for instance, if you're taking a pec fly to failure versus a barbell bench press, very, very different in terms of the cumulative fatigue that is going to occur as a result. A barbell bench press, especially if you're a very strong person, if you're very muscular, it's going to be very, very fatiguing, or it can be anyways. Whereas a pec fly, yeah, it's going to mess you up, but it's going to be very localized and you're not going to have the same type of neurological fatigue as you would if you're using a super, super heavy load benching, like 400 pounds or whatever for like a set of 6 or 8 or something like that. very different in terms of the fatigue cost, okay? So that does need to be something that you keep in mind. Generally speaking, I don't think it's as safe if you're taking a set to failure, if you're utilizing low reps, especially if it's on big compound movements. That doesn't mean that it's automatically unsafe. So I'm not saying that. I'm saying that utilizing other exercises and taking those ones to failure is probably a little bit safer, okay? That doesn't make these unsafe, it just means that this one is probably safer. That's more my opinion than anything, but that's also based on quite a bit of experience, both personally as well as coaching athletes, speaking to other high-level coaches and researchers and things like that. So take that for what it's worth. So again, you got to consider the rep range that you're taking to failure. You also have to consider the exercise, right? So if I'm taking a barbell back squat to failure and I'm only doing 5 reps, probably not the best idea, right? If I'm taking like a leg press to failure and I'm only doing like 5 or 6 reps, that's actually probably not that bad, right? Because 1, it's externally stabilized. 2, you've got built-in safeties, right? Because if you can't push it up, you know that there's a safety there. So if anything happens and the weight drops for whatever reason, it's going to hit the safety and you're good, okay? So there is a time and a place for everything, but I think that there are generally, maybe slightly better ways and slightly less better ways to do things, but that's up for you to decide as well, okay? Now, let's talk about some basics of biomechanics, all right? We'll talk a little bit about like the functional anatomy of the chest. So muscles don't work in isolation, but we can be intentional in terms of how we direct the stimulus, okay? So there's a big difference between internal and external stability, especially when we're choosing various exercises, okay? So that can also significantly impact muscle recruitment, all right? Let's take the bench press. When we're doing the bench press, the stability requirements allow you to minimize injury risk, which is much more important, in my opinion, than limiting the outside muscular contributions. So what I mean by that is generally if you look at a powerlifter and they set up for a bench press, they've got the arch, chest is up, scapula retracted, depressed, okay, they're really, really tight here. If you were to kind of push on their body, there's not going to be a whole lot of motion. They're super compressed, they're super compact, very tight, they've got a lot of passive tension and very active tension too. So that's utilizing your whole body in order to press the weight up. Now there's pros and cons to that. Are we getting maximal chest recruitment? No, probably not. But because the bench press is up a barbell is fixed, sometimes that can be not so forgiving on the shoulders, especially if you're doing lots of volume. So it's probably better to get better stability, to get better joint positioning and get better positioning of your whole body in general, and utilize other muscles like your lats and your back and maybe leg drive or other things to help facilitate a better position and better stability and safety than it would be to, utilize maybe less stability and less, control through the shoulders and things like that, but get more tension on the chest because you're probably also going to get more tension on the anterior delts, probably going to wear it out a little bit, probably not the best. A lot of people can experience some shoulder issues or like impingements or just discomfort and things like that. So in my opinion, it would be a much better trade-off to get into a more effective setup position, even though we're generally getting a little bit less recruitment of the pecs. Anyone who says that the barbell bench press is not a good exercise for building your chest is quite frankly a fucking idiot. And there's not really any excuse for that if you're someone who's been in the industry for a long enough period of time. Look at all of the best bodybuilders, right, in history. You think any of them got that chest without doing bench press? No, they all did it. Arnold did bench press. Everyone does bench press. So to say that it's a bad exercise is insane. It's not a bad exercise at all. I personally got up to, I believe, 285. And pretty much all I did was just very specific barbell work. And I got up to 285 pounds. Right now, I'm much lighter. I'm like 250, 254 this morning. But yeah, like I got up to that doing very little dumbbell work, no machine work, okay? And that was several long time ago. But my point is you can build a substantial amount of muscle just doing bench press, okay? That's not the best way to do it, but to say that it's a bad exercise is ridiculous. And honestly, I can't see any reason for why anyone could say that. It's just silly, right? But there are other exercises that are potentially better because of their loading profile, because of their fatigue cost, because of the orthopedic stress that's generated through them, and other things as well. But the bench press is still a great exercise, all right? So that's an example as well. Also, when we look at some people doing dumbbell presses on like a Swiss ball or a Bosu ball, right? They'll be doing presses like this, and it's like that stability, and you're like, oh, why are you doing it? Oh, it makes it more challenging, it makes it more functional. No, it doesn't make it more functional, it just makes you more stupid. That's it, right? Training on unstable surfaces downregulates force production. It actually downregulates your ability to generate force, okay? That's a protective mechanism that your nervous system has, because it's like, oh, this guy is an idiot. He's trying to do, heavy lifting on an unstable surface. Let's just throttle it back a little bit so he's not able to lift any substantial amount of weight so he can't hurt himself. Okay, so training on unstable surfaces has no real place in strength training or in hypertrophy, right? Outside of like maybe some extremely rare cases for like injury or rehab or things like that, maybe dealing with like specific compensatory patterns, I really can't think of any general reason why you'd want to train on unstable surfaces. So we want a good amount of internal and external stability in order to control how we're absorbing load and also how we're generating force and where it's being transmitted through and what tissues are primarily being recruited and activated. If we're looking to do a bench press or a dumbbell press or any sort of chest movement, we're not just looking to move the weight from point A to point B. Yes, that is going to happen, but that is a byproduct of the actual objective, which is to move the insertion closer to the origin. So your pec is going to insert right in here, and your origin, obviously, you've got the various heads of the pec, right? So you've got the sternal head, you've got the clavicular head, and blah, blah, blah. So you want to make sure that this guy over here gets closer to this guy over here. That's basically the objective. And we want to make sure that we're doing that utilizing the pec specifically. So that function is going to be the most important thing. So if we're training our chest and you're feeling your biceps and you're feeling all other muscles, but your chest is not getting a pump, or like your shoulders or something like that, you're not doing a very good job at recruiting your pecs. Okay, and this is where not only the biomechanics, but your structural anatomy is actually very, very important. Because you can do, people say, oh, dumbbell bench press, great for your chest. And you can do dumbbell chest press until the cows come home. But I've seen guys that do that. There's a guy at my old gym, massive delts, zero chest. Why is that? Well, it's because he doesn't actually execute the exercise with his structure in mind, right? So he's doing it like everyone else does it, but that's not how he's actually shaped. So he needs to change the actual angle of his rib cage before he can get better loading through the pec. And until he does that, he can do bench press until the cows come home. He's just going to get monstrous delts. That's it. He's not going to get a bigger chest. Okay? So this is very, very important. It's not just like a minor detail. It's actually very important. Okay? So we want to make sure that we're taking the insertion to the origin. We're closing that gap and we're getting as much tension in there as possible. And the muscle, the target tissue, in this case the chest, is what's driving that motion. Another thing that's important to understand is that the function of a muscle is somewhat context dependent. Okay? Now, I want to be very clear about what I'm saying here. If we look at the pec, we can say, okay, the pec does this, adduction. All right? That's true. We can also say that the pec, to some degree, is going to elevate the arm, but if the arm's overhead, it's going to pull the arm down a little bit. So there's a variety of different functions. If the arm is behind us, so if we're in shoulder extension, the pec is actually going to pull us into shoulder flexion, okay? If our arm is way overhead and we flex the pec, it's going to kind of depress the scapula a little bit, okay? So it's going to pull the arm down slightly. So if we have our arm behind our back like this, the pec is not going to necessarily internally rotate. It's actually going to have to externally rotate first, okay? So there's a variety of different functions of the pec. And again, this is kind of minutia. So I'm not trying to say that the pec is an external rotator. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in this position where your arm is behind your back, like you're doing kind of the reach around behind your back, there is going to be a portion of that range of motion because you're so internally rotated that when we activate the pec is actually going to facilitate the initiation of external rotation. Once we reach basically like right here, that pec is not going to be contributing to external rotation anymore, and it's going to be other muscles, okay? But the reason why this isn't just, like, oh, this is just minutia. No, it's not. The position of your body matters. The structure of your body matters. How you execute the exercise matters. That's what determines how we're driving tension into the tissues. And if we're not driving tension into the tissues, we're just moving weight from point A to point B, which means we're not necessarily getting the specific hypertrophy response that we want, which is a gigantic freaking chest, okay? Like ideally you want to be big enough so you can just sit down and rest your chin on your chest and fall asleep. That's the dream. That's the real American dream. All right. Now, ribcage position. Okay. Ribcage position is very important. So for instance, if I'm doing an incline bench press and I have a flat back, that's going to target more of the upper fibers of the chest. Okay. If I really arch my back and I pull my scaps back and I depress them and I get really tight, almost like a kind of a powerlifting type approach where you're really setting your back up, having a nice solid arch, well, that changes the orientation of my rib cage, which means it's changing how force is being applied to my chest. And it changes the loading profile of this movement, which means that now as I arch my back and I'm in an incline, I'm not targeting as much of the kind of upper fibers. I'm targeting a little bit more of the mid-range or the sternal fibers, okay? And again, this is not like 100%, right? There's substantial variability from person to person. I've seen it myself. So it's not sufficient to say that, oh, this exercise is going to do this because blah, blah, blah. I mean, as a general rule, yeah, that's kind of the assumption, right? And I think for most people that can apply. But there's plenty of instances, and I've been coaching for over 12 years, and I think because I've coached so many damn people, I've seen many, many instances where that just is insufficient as a recommendation. We need to be very clear on what exercises, positions, and executions are actually driving tension into the specific area. So it's important to play around with this. And you can even just kind of like, if you take your shirt off and you're doing the bench press and you kind of like lift up and you sort of get into that lengthened position, you can actually see by changing the structure of your rib cage, by changing your position, what position is actually going to recruit which aspect of the pec. So that's kind of that's something that's actually pretty helpful. In fact, Ben Pekulski, a former Olympia guy, a buddy of mine, he was in Calgary. I'm living in Calgary right now. He was in Calgary not too long ago, and this was actually one of the things that we were talking about. We were in the gym doing some work, whatever, and he was talking about this, and this is a really important thing, right? Like, this is one of the biggest, most jacked guys on the planet, and he's saying, hey, this is really important. And I also believe that this is really important. So it's not something you can slough off, right? So that's a really important point. Now, I mentioned earlier that I've got a free gift for you guys. I wrote a bench press manual for Kabuki Strength. This is behind their paid wall, so it wasn't accessible to everyone. You actually had to be a member before you could get access to it. It's extremely comprehensive. I know that it was really big. I know a lot of people were signing up specifically for this thing, and they purchased their membership for that. And so I know that it was really, really popular for their demographic. So it's very, very deep dive on bench press mechanics. Okay, so it talks about exercise selection. It talks about weak points. If you're failing at different points of the bench press, what you need to do to get stronger. Very, very comprehensive. I turned it into a PDF. If you guys want it, make sure you check out my Instagram. I'm going to get my girl Audrey, who's the production lead here, to put a link somewhere here, or maybe in the comments, or whatever. Go there, hit me up on Instagram, send me a DM, and I'll send it to you personally. Okay, I'll send you the link personally. So if you want that, make sure you head over to my Instagram. Also, give me a follow. Don't be stingy. If you like the shit that I'm putting out, help me grow my business, help me grow my brand, man. I'm not great at the marketing stuff. I'm smart, I know how to coach, but I'm not always the best when it comes to marketing. So this is my really lame, unsmooth, unpolished pitch. Go over, follow my account, send me a DM. I'll send you this manual for free. All right, moving on. So then we can talk about the implementation side of things. All right, now this is where the rubber hits the road. We've talked a lot about how muscle growth works. We talked about some of the differences in terms of loading parameters, exercise selection, range of motion consideration, orientation of your rib cage, and the biomechanics, and just general anatomy. Okay, so this is where we can actually look at how to take that and put it into something that actually gets you a ginormous fucking chest. Okay, so first we need to talk about the SRA curve. All right, so the SRA curve stands for stimulus, recovery, adaptation. All right, now when we are considering the SRA curve, right, this is something that we kind of alluded to earlier, where if we elicit a certain response, so let's say we take a barbell back squat and we take it to failure for like 8 reps, okay, we're getting a really big stimulus, but we're also getting a huge amount of fatigue. So we might not be able to squat again for at least a week. If you're a really strong guy, at least a week. For some strong guys, probably 2, maybe even 3 weeks, right, before you can actually squat again. If you're taking an actual squat, to an 8 rep max and you're a really strong guy who squats like 800 pounds, 1,000 pounds, something like that, you're not going to be able to squat for a while, okay? If you're a weaker guy, not as much. You probably won't need quite as much time, but the point still remains that if you're doing that, it's going to take a long time to recover. If you're taking a leg extension to an 8 rep max, or like a hack squat, maybe a better example, to an 8 rep max, yeah, it's going to really mess you up, but it's going to be more localized fatigue. You're not getting the same axial loading on your spine. So systemically, it's not generating the same amount of fatigue. So you actually might be able to train your quads twice in 1 week. Might not even be a problem. You'll definitely be able to train your quads the next week if you can't train it this week. So the amount of fatigue, the systemic fatigue that you're generating is very different. Now, we need to make sure that we have a sufficient amount of time to recover before we hit the next session. However, we also need to make sure that we're still hitting enough sessions to make sure that we're kind of heading in that productive way. If we're generating so much fatigue that we can't squat again or we can't hit our legs for another 2 weeks, that's crazy. Our training frequency just isn't high enough to get the results we want because we're not getting enough training frequency, okay? Now, our systemic fatigue is super high, but we're not getting the same type of hypertrophy response, or at least it's my opinion. We're definitely not maximizing it if that's what you're doing. So when you're looking at the SRA curve, it's important to understand how fatiguing certain things are. And you want to be very strategic in terms of if you're going to take a set to failure, understand the fatigue cost, understand the potential risk of injury, understand that maybe taking higher reps to failure and things like that, probably a little bit safer than taking like a 4 rep max to failure, okay? Doing a leg extension to failure for like 15 reps, probably better than taking a barbell squat to failure for 15 reps, right? So there's going to be trade-offs, and again, you need to understand the SRA curve so that you can understand stimulus drives fatigue, then we recover, and then we get that positive adaptation, okay? But if we never really recover, we're not able to get that next training session so that we can continue those productive adaptations. We're just going to build more and more and more fatigue, and we're never really going to recover. Or our sessions are going to be so infrequent that we can never really gain enough momentum to get that adaptation. So something to consider. Now, training frequency. Generally speaking, if you're training your chest for muscle, I would recommend training between 2 to 3 times a week, okay? So we're talking about your chest here. Now, larger muscle groups generally are more systemically fatiguing to train and generally require a little bit more recovery time. Now, that's not a perfectly correct statement because we can look at the triceps. Triceps are a huge muscle, but we can train those with really high frequency, okay? And so it's not 100% accurate that the bigger the muscle group, the more systemically fatiguing it is. But as a rule of thumb, it's pretty accurate, okay? Chest, more fatiguing than shoulders. Quads, more fatiguing than biceps. You know what I mean? Like, so you kind of get a general sense. So as a general rule, I think it's a very good rule, and it's something you can follow. I generally would adopt a varied approach. So I would adopt, if I was training my chest 2 to 3 times a week, I would adopt a high, medium, and low approach, right? I'm personally a fan of doing all of those. Now, you don't necessarily always want to be doing that because you might think, oh, well, that way I get the best of both worlds. Not necessarily the case. However, it is still a pretty good idea to kind of vary up the rep range even within a certain mesocycle. So you might have day 1 be like a 5x5, very simple, basic approach. And then maybe on your other day that's more higher volume, you can do like 4 sets of 12 to 15 or something like that. Or maybe even 15 to 20, I don't know, depending on what your protocol is, okay? And that way you can actually check off, a few, you can cover more of your bases that way, right? So you're getting a good neurological stimulus for strength, which actually is really important long-term for strength development, especially when muscle gains become a lot more difficult, especially as a natural. You really need to focus on performance and other things that can help kind of eke out some of that progress long-term. So it's not just about muscle. That's not the only consideration here. We need to think about other adaptations that can either directly or indirectly over the long run impact your ability for growth, okay? So I personally am a fan of high, medium, and low approaches, right? So if you've got 3 sessions, one is a higher intensity, one is lower intensity, one is kind of moderate. And that's going to also correlate to your amount of fatigue, right? So you do, let's say 5x5, that can be a little bit fatiguing, but it's not too bad, right? If you're doing 4x12, you're going to get a crazy pump, and it's going to be a little bit more localized. Maybe you're doing a couple sets of like 15 to 20. That's going to be good for just kind of getting blood in. You're going to get a little bit of pump, but it's really not going to be that bad, okay? Especially if you pick like a pec fly to do that with. Your chest's going to be sore, but you'll be totally fine, okay? So you can kind of think of things like that. That's one potential approach. I'm not saying you need to do that, but that's a approach. Now, volume is going to be individual, okay? And so there's a lot of variability here, so don't take this as the gospel truth, But generally, I'd recommend starting with around 12 to 15 hard sets per week, then slowly progressing from there. Now, when I say hard sets, I mean hard working sets. So let's say you're doing, you've got prescribed on this particular day, 2 sets of 8 to 10, and then 1 set of 12 to 15, or something like that, okay, for one of your exercises. And, you might take 3 sets to warm up to that, and then you find your working weight, and then you do 3 weights. So those working up sets don't count, okay? It's just your actual work sets. So when you're doing whatever load that you're going to be doing for the 8 to 12 reps, and then the 12 to 15 reps, that's the actual load that you use. So that's the number of sets. So in that case, it's going to be 3. So we don't count the 3 warm-up sets that we did, or however many warm-up sets you might have done. Okay, so it's just the 3 working sets that we're counting. Now, reason why I say 12 to 15 hard sets, I know it sounds like a low amount for a lot of people, and realistically it is kind of a lower amount. But the reason why I say that is because this is going off the assumption that 1, your execution is fantastic, your technique is phenomenal, your load selection is appropriate, and you are working really fucking hard. You're working within that 3 reps or less proximity to failure. In some cases, even going straight to failure or even beyond failure. When you train like that, you need substantially less volume. So I generally would bias on the lower end. I have had tons of people get phenomenal results, not going past 15 sets, okay? And these are pretty damn big guys. So like I'm talking about one dude who's like 5'4", but he's like 200 pounds, like just fucking yoked. Another dude that I know, really, really big guy actually, he's like maybe 250, 260, and he gets phenomenal results, but he's only doing, I think, about 14 sets a week. So still not that much, right? He's a very big guy, he's a very advanced guy, and he pushes insanely hard, but he gets great progress just from that. When I start to push much higher than that, he starts to blow up. So when I kind of get a little closer to like that 20 set range, he starts to blow up, get shoulder issues, elbow issues, and all sorts of stuff. So if we keep it within a certain range, he gets great progress, doesn't have a bunch of orthopedic stress, he's growing, he's getting leaner, all this stuff is great, but when you start to push a little harder, just can't handle it. Now, like I said, there is a lot of variability between individuals, but it is something to consider that when you're training to the right intensity, at the right level of technical execution, you can get a ton out of less, because per unit of work, you're getting so much more. Whereas if I'm just slinging weights, I might have to double or triple the volume because I'm getting way less stimulus directly on the chest. I'm getting a bunch of fucking stress on my shoulders, my triceps, and a bunch of other shit, but I'm not actually targeting my chest. So when you really learn how to target a specific muscle, it's not that you need less volume. It's just that now you're doing a better job targeting that muscle. So the volume you're doing is actually going and being directed towards that tissue, which means now you're getting more accurate representation of what your muscle actually needs to grow, right? Whereas before, yeah, sure, you were doing double the volume, but you were doing it twice as shitty. So it doesn't really pan out, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Do not underestimate the significance of that point. This is very, very important. When I was squatting and I was like seeing the best progress, I was doing a total of 6 sets per week of my legs. 6 sets. That's it. That is so little. That's across all exercises. That is barbell squats, that's leg press, that's leg extensions, Bulgarian split squats, any exercise that I had that was a quad focused exercise. I was doing 6 to 8 sets, and that's where I was seeing the best progress for that particular cycle that I was in. Okay, and that training cycle, I saw crazy progress. And I've noticed that even to this day, I still don't really do much more than about 10 sets. I very rarely will cross 10 sets of actual training, and my legs continue to grow. So again, when you learn how to train really, really, really hard, you're not going to need as much volume. Now, I'm not going to say that that's going to be true for everyone, in the sense that there's super high level bodybuilders who might need like triple that. They might be doing 30 sets of quads per week, right? But they're super advanced. They have a hyper specific type of training they need, and they need a lot more in order to grow. So that's a little bit different. But for the vast majority of us mere mortals, you don't need as much volume if you're training with a high degree of intent, good execution, and that's the main thing, because you're not wasting anything, okay? So again, there's nothing special about the 12 to 15 rep range. I'm saying that's a good starting point. So if you end up needing 20 or more, totally fine, no problem with that whatsoever. I've got lots of clients actually who do have much, much higher volumes. I'm just saying, start there. That way you don't go too much too quickly, and you can kind of progress things much easier. It's much easier to progress things than it is to do too much and then have to regress, okay? I have to reiterate, the objective here is not to lift the most amount of weight. The objective is to target the tissue. So if I'm doing pec flies, and I'm getting a really consistent technique, and then my form starts to break down as I get fatigued, and I start going, ugh, and I'm like pushing my shoulders forward and doing this, and using my traps and getting burning in my biceps and my shoulders. I'm not targeting my chest anymore. I'd be much better getting less reps, but having them all target the chest. So it's not about how much weight you're doing. It's not about, how many reps you're doing obviously is important, as we discussed, but it's less about how many reps you're doing. It's more about the target, about where you're driving the stimulus. So it's very important that you're using the appropriate exercise selection, that your technique is really, really phenomenal. I cannot stress how important that is, okay? We want to select exercises that you can go through a nice, large range of motion where you can really bias that length and position, get a great stretch in it, and also the mid-range too. And we're getting a really good stimulus within that range, okay? Because as I mentioned earlier, that's the most hypertrophically stimulative range of motion generally. So for instance, if I was doing a fly movement, I would do a machine fly or a cable fly, and I'd probably pick that over dumbbells. Why? Because up here, and like from here to here, I'm not really getting much stimulus, right? Because this is the axis of rotation, and this is where the line of force is, right? So there's not much tension on my chest when the dumbbell's here. Whereas if it's a cable and it's pulling me that way, I'm gonna have lots of tension through here, and even at the bottom, I'm gonna have tons of tension as well. So it's just a better force profile. Now, does that mean dumbbells are bad? Absolutely not. So many people and so many old school bodybuilders who have insane physiques did tons of dumbbell flies, right? So I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying this is kind of, there is some strategy when it comes to exercise selection, okay? So I would generally choose like a machine pec fly or a cable pec fly over a dumbbell, but if you don't have that, that's fine. Dumbbells are great. They do a phenomenal job, okay? I would generally choose probably bias dumbbells over barbell. It's not to say barbell bench press isn't good. I do barbell bench press, right? But in the phase that I'm at right now, and I don't always do this, but in the phase that I'm at right now, I actually do dumbbell presses and like some shoulder work before I do barbell bench press, right? So I'm intending to kind of fatigue certain muscles before, so that when I go in there, I know that this is what's failing me, right? So I get a little bit more out of it, right? But I'm not going to get as much fatigue because I have to drop the weight. So there's some strategy to it, right? So I'm not saying barbell's bad, but there's differences in terms of the loading profiles. We've got a variety of different exercises you can choose from. So I'm going to give you guys a couple exercises that I really enjoy. This is not a completely exhaustive list, but these are some ones that I really enjoy that I find to be very, very effective, okay? I obviously have a little bit more of a bias towards strength as well, but I still obviously want to get super jacked and all that stuff, so these are great for both, okay? So we've got a couple. One, any sort of like feet up or flat back barbell bench press is going to be a great option, right? When we eliminate the arch, I know what I said earlier about trading off like range of motion for stability, but we can still have really good stability doing a feet up or flat back bench press. It's just we're not like loose. You don't want to be loose when you're benching, but you'll still keep, good lat activation, keep nice and stable. The scapula are going to be depressed. You're getting a nice good range of motion, good control. So if you're doing it effectively, you're increasing the range of motion. You're going to decrease the load on the bar because you have less additional support coming from external sources, but you're still going to get a great stimulus, right? So that, the flat back or a feet up bench press, phenomenal. You can utilize a camber bar for bench press. Basically, this sort of, this additional range that you get because the bar, how the bar is shaped, allows you to kind of get further than the chest. So that additional range can put more stretch on your pecs. Again, buffalo bar bench press, very similar thing. You can do that. We alter the range of motion. Doing 1.5 bench press. This can be phenomenal because you go all the way down, come halfway up, all the way down, then all the way up. This basically allows you to double the amount of volume you're getting in the lengthened and mid-range position, which again, more stimulative. So these are all great exercises. Then we can look at things like a cable chest fly or a pec deck. I'm a big fan of the pec deck because again, there's just a little bit more stability. Not that you really need tons of stability when you're doing a cable fly, but I personally just like it better. I think because of the positioning, it's easier for me to focus on really recruiting my chest. Whereas with the cables, especially when I'm getting like really, really fatigued, I find that, my biceps do start to take over a little bit when I get fatigued on the cables, whereas on a pec deck, not as much, right? So that's one of the reasons why I prefer it, but I'd still think that you should be doing both, right? Dumbbell bench press variations. Again, we can do flat back, we can do just a regular dumbbell bench press, we can do incline, but also being aware of your rib cage position and how the rib cage position is going to alter how the tissue is being targeted and which aspect of the pec you're really trying to train, okay? We can look at the chest press machine. Again, this is externally stabilized, so we can really emphasize recruitment of the pecs because we're not having to do a lot of other things, right? It's kind of a fixed motion position, so we can really just focus on that squeeze and get the most out of it, okay? Now, another thing that's important, and this is something I've hammered on through this entire video, is execution. Technical execution is so important, not just for injury, but for the actual stimulus that you're getting. The number of people that I see training, and this is powerlifters and strongmen are awful for this. You'd be shocked at the number of powerlifters I see. They'll go and do lat pull downs and they look like they're just fucking flopping their body around. It basically looks like a full body dry heave. It's horrendous technique. Or they're doing rows and they're like, and they're turning their whole body and their lat's doing like that much of the work. It's like, I don't know what you're doing, but it's not lat work, right? They do this in leg extensions. They do this all the time. So strength athletes, you guys are by far the worst when it comes to actually learning how to target a muscle. Great when it comes to technical execution and fine details when it comes to strength. But when it comes to the hypertrophy side of things, generally, a lot of them are terrible, okay? So really, really make sure when you're executing, okay, you want to focus on a couple things. One, slow, eccentric, slow, not just controlled. Actually move slowly, okay? Because I guarantee you, you're probably not as controlled and stable and all that stuff as you think. So when you move a lot slower, it's going to force you to learn how to develop that mind-muscle connection. I can tell you this from experience. I've worked with lots of extremely experienced people at international elite levels who are like world champions or have like international records and things like that. And I can tell you, even those guys who are extremely experienced still fall short on this a lot of the times, okay? So slow, eccentric, control, and that will help give you a more directed stimulus. It's also going to give you more time to kind of feel the movement, to position your body a little bit differently and feel what's giving you the best stimulus, okay? Pause at the end range. This is a really great trick, pausing at the end range. If it's a dumbbell bench press, one, it's going to dissipate the stretch reflex and can actually really help mitigate injuries. I definitely know when I get guys who come to me who are like, I've got kind of sore pec tendons on both sides, so we got to be careful what I'm doing. A lot of the times I just program like some tempo work in there, and one of the things that I do is I say slow eccentrics, 2 count pause at the bottom or 2 second pause at the bottom. All of a sudden, after 2 weeks, oh, hey, I don't have any pain in my pec tendons anymore. Yeah, because you're controlling that end range. You're not getting the same type of stress because you're just kind of bouncing it off. That's not great technique. We're not getting the stimulus where it needs to go. Now it's going into kind of the passive tissues like the tendons, the ligaments, and the joints and things like that. That's not very good. We want to direct it into the muscle belly itself, okay? So utilizing tempo, having that pause, dissipates some of the stretch reflex and allows you to just kind of feel the movement a little bit better so we're not just kind of bouncing off and again, dissipating that force or the tension. Okay, it's also going to be really good for preventing injury or at least minimizing risk of injury. Okay, now if you're at the top, let's say you're doing a lateral raise. Okay, well, there is no stretch reflex up here, so why would I pause at the top? Well, the reason you might pause at the top if you're doing a lateral raise or something like that, where the mechanics are a little bit different, is because it's going to force you to lock into that muscle. People oftentimes, they just kind of throw weights, right? And if you're doing that and you let it come down quickly, you're not locking into that muscle. When you come up and you come up nice and smooth and controlled, and then you hold, you really feel way more connection into your, in this case, the delt, because we're doing a lateral raise. So when you go back down, the eccentric is going to get way more stimulus because now all of it's being driven by the delt. So it really helps build up that mind-muscle connection. Okay, this is one of the reasons why I always like to pause briefly. Okay, you don't need to be like 1,000, 2 1,000 for every rep, but you do want like pause, come back down nice and slow. Pause, come back down nice and slow. Really control your range of motion, okay? Now the concentric, okay? So if we're doing a dumbbell bench press, as we lower, the muscle is lengthening under tension. That's the eccentric phase. Isometric phase, obviously going to be kind of at the bottom here. The concentric phase is where the muscle's under tension, but it's shortening. So that's when we're pressing, okay? Or that's when if we're doing a lat pull down, we're pulling. Concentric, if we're doing a bicep curl, is when we're curling the weight up. That's the concentric phase. So that, we don't want it to be explosive or fast, because the explosive movement does generate high tension, but it's not the kind of, it's not the type of mechanical tension that's going to create a lot of hypertrophy. It's just not, okay? So we want to make sure that we're having a controlled movement, okay? And we're locking into the muscle. So don't be explosive. Now, when you see certain high-level lifters using, momentum and doing, like using kind of momentum, or they're kind of slinging weights a little bit, and they're genuinely really elite athletes, I will tell you this, even though it looks like they're moving, their connection to their muscle is extremely high level. You are not that guy. So don't necessarily look at what they're doing right now and be like, oh, I can do that because they're doing that. That's not how that works. When I used to fight, I used to box at a fairly high level. And when I would teach, I remember one time there was a kid who would come in and he was fairly new and he would do the Philly shell, right? So Philly shell, I don't know if you're familiar with boxing, you're kind of like this, kind of like the Floyd Mayweather style. And he would box like that. I would always tell him, no, you're not boxing like that. That's not how you do it. I'd be like, you need to keep your hands up like this. He's like, well, Floyd Mayweather does it. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize you were one of the best defensive boxers on the planet. My mistake, Your Highness. And the mistake that he's making is he thinks he's as good as Floyd. Floyd learned to box like this. He learned the fundamentals. He learned all the mechanics. And then once he became a master of it, then he developed his own style. This kid did not do that. And in the same way, if you look at elite bodybuilders and you're like, oh, well, they're cheating, they're using momentum. Yes, but they did all of that stuff so that when they do that, they're getting a really, really great stimulus still. You're not that level yet. You can't do that. You're not good enough to do it yet. So don't do it. Just focus on really, really good technique, and that's going to make it last so much longer. And in the end, if you end up deciding to do that, but you're still getting great results, hey, that's okay. But if you're not if you haven't gained like 50 or 60 pounds just doing really good, solid technique, very controlled and smooth, then you've got no business trying to train like Ronnie Coleman or anyone else who's doing that, because you're not that guy. You need to respect where you're at. You need to respect the execution and put in enough time to really learn how to target and train your muscles. It's very hard. It's not easy. Even for me, I've been doing this for a very long time. And I'd say only recently have I become really, really good at targeting muscles. It's a difficult skill set to manage. So don't underestimate this. Don't think you're better than that. Don't be like, oh, I'm doing this for a week, therefore I got it. I doubt it, okay? Really take this seriously and make sure that you're doing this effectively. And I guarantee your results will go through the roof. You will get the fucking most insane pumps and you're blowing your chest up. You will grow your chest like crazy if you honor these principles, okay? So here's one last thing I want to say. This is a very good starting point, but there's a lot more to growing your chest than just the training side of things. We also need to consider behavior, lifestyle, recovery, sleep, diet, all sorts of different things, okay?